And ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of World Talks here on TVP World. I'm your host, Benjamin Lee, and please join me and my guests on this next interview. A lot of discussions will be had today, first involving the election in Moldova as it continues to unfold, and then we'll be taking a look at the migration policy situation with the newly announced Polish migration strategy by the Prime Minister. And last but not least, perhaps if we do have some time, we'll touch upon U.S. President Joe Biden's recent meeting with European leaders in Germany. Joining us today to unpack all these topics is Daniela Schwarzer, Executive Board Member at the Bertelsmann Stiftung. Hello and welcome to TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the most pressing topic because we do know that the Moldovan election is still unfolding. What's the most recent update, and can we kind of use that as a bellwether of whether or not the country is turning towards a more European Union perspective?
Well, two things happened in Moldova yesterday. One was the presidential election, the first round, and the second thing that happened was a referendum on writing into the Moldovan constitution that becoming a member of the EU is a goal the country should pursue. And the latest results we have is that with a very, very small margin, there is a yes for EU integration of the country, which is actually great news because Moldova would start negotiations in June if everything goes as planned. Writing this into the constitution is no prerequisite for the negotiations to begin. This is just a political goal set into the constitution, which the current president actually wants to have there, because in case of a change of government, this would oblige even a government that is EU skeptical to pursue the negotiations. So I would say with that small margin, there's moderate good news from Moldova, but we also have to recognize that there was a huge degree of Russian influence in the elections. We are, of course, keenly waiting for the results of the observers who have been posted throughout the country to observe the regularities of the elections. But the Moldovan security services have already spoken about the attempts of huge voter manipulation. There's news out that about 100,000 euros were spent to actually bribe voters to give a vote against EU accession and against the current president, Maia Sandu, who stands for the Western orientation of the country. But still, it looks like the referendum goes well. And she came out first in the presidential election and will have to go into a second round on November 3rd.
All right. Is this number somewhat projected, or did they overperform when it comes to their wills and aspiration to join the European Union? Because, like you mentioned, it is very much a very, very thin margin.
It is a very thin margin, and the expectations were slightly higher for a pro-EU vote. However, her personal electoral results were better than expected. So I think there's a mixed message today, but also I think the key question is, to what extent did the manipulation of voters influence the electoral results? And I would say from the outside, observing the news that are out about pressure put onto voters, financial bribes given to voters to actually go and vote, I think the results in that context are a clear signal that in the country there is support for EU integration and support for a president who stands for reforms of her country, the fight against corruption and the Western orientation of Moldova.
Is there something we can read into the fact that the president overperformed a little bit than the projection, but the aspiration for European Union didn't perform as well, that we can perhaps kind of unravel a little bit of where these kind of campaign influence puts more emphasis on? Or am I trying to put two and two together and get a 5.5?
Well, I think, the main issue for Moldova is, of course, to understand what does EU accession mean. And it looks good as a goal, but when you then look into the process, it's really an adjustment that the country has to go through. And it may well be that some people are skeptical of that process. But if I think through what would be the actual target of interventionism into the elections from the Russian side be, what would they focus on? I think they would clearly focus on a situation where it looks like that the population doesn't support the westward orientation of the country. And if the results, the final results, which are expected during the day, if they actually turn out to have a yes in favor of that constitutional change, I think that is a very clear win for Maia Sandu, who had the idea of putting up that referendum and making it more of a political obligation for any government to bring Moldova closer to the European Union.
Right. So like you mentioned, we're still waiting for the final votes to come out and the situation to unfold, but that does give us something to look forward to. Now, I would like to direct our attention to another highly talked about, very contentious issue for the past few weeks, ever since the announcement of Prime Minister Tusk's immigration policy. I think initially he drew a lot of international ire on the humanitarian front especially, but now we're seeing more and more EU leaders kind of siding with him when it comes to the migration issue and the security of the border. Where do you fall on this topic?
Well, first of all, I think it's very interesting to see how several countries have made statements that were initially very much criticized. And then some way or another, really the consensus in the European Union has changed. Donald Tusk announced to be more restrictive on asylum. The German Chancellor a few weeks ago announced border controls of a temporary nature, so compatible with the Schengen arrangements within the European Union, which basically says there shouldn't be border controls. And he was also very much criticized. But I think as a matter of fact, we now discover that more and more countries, under the pressure of, in particular, far-right political forces, readjust their stance on immigration. And I would say the political risk at the moment is that we have a number of national measures which don't only protect, of course, the external borders of those countries, but can also hamper the single market and the freedom of circulation of people within the European Union, which is why the German measure was so much criticized. And so I think there is high time that we take the task much more seriously to look at external border protection, where things are in place. We have Frontex, the border control agency, and so on, but that is not strong enough. And I do believe there are two political tasks to fulfill. One is external border protection, and here Poland comes in, of course, as a key player with a border that was already used by Russia to transport migrants to the border and put political pressure on the Polish government through that. And the other task is really to find a system which enables internal distribution and burden sharing in a fairer way. And there's a pact out there which is supposed to come into force in 1 year time. And now there's pressure to actually advance measures to have a more coherent European approach.
All right. Do you think the rapid shift of the position of some of these commentators or these European leaders is a sign that perhaps the Polish Prime Minister is just saying the quiet part out loud, that everyone has been thinking about it, but just waiting for someone to make that make that first statement? Or do you think that some of the arguments following the announcement were convincing enough for them to decide, yeah, perhaps it is a good time to start thinking about how to balance the humanitarian issues and security?
Well, I think he said it first, but I do believe that already some were thinking very much the same way. And there's one risk which we have to balance in the European Union, and that is that we take measures or announce things that are basically paying tribute to rising far-right populist pressure within the European Union. What I said earlier is that we need a very balanced and very realistic approach to immigration to the European Union. And there is the question of illegal immigration, there's the question of asylum, but there's also the question of immigration we actually want and need, because we need migrants because of our demography in the European Union. And this needs to be balanced, and we need probably measures that act more quickly than the current legislative package, which has been agreed, but which takes a long time to implement. But what we should not do is to react in a very short-term way to pressures that will arise in many countries, and Italy is another one, where we see a short-term measure now taken with the idea of having asylum processes outside of Italy in Albania, and where we saw over the weekend that this measure doesn't actually work from a legal perspective. So we need to make sure that there is no short-term action that then doesn't work, but rather a balanced approach which grants a certain openness, of course, to asylum seekers and humanitarian needs that exist at the borders. And we have seen in winter that terrible things can happen when migration is actually weaponized and people are pushed towards borders that are closed. So I think there is a humanitarian responsibility which is hugely important, and that balance needs to be struck without two short-term issues that feed into the populist narrative that Europe should really close all borders entirely.
Right. I think this also addressed some of the criticisms previously by people who are worried about immigration having no party to really align with except the more right-wing ones that are pushing the electorate to that direction. Perhaps it is high time that the issue is taking into a more direct and balanced approach. Thank you so much for your input and insight. Really appreciate it. Thanks for being with us.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for watching this edition of World Talks. But for more news, update, and commentary, please stay tuned to TVP World.